When somebody dies, you go through shock, then you go through anger, then you go through mourning, then you're back to anger, then you end up with shock. That's the only way I think that it works.
Just imagine what 60 consecutive days of relentless physical exertion feels like. The human body wasn't designed to sustain that level of performance without adequate rest. But that was the reality Michael Jackson faced in the spring and summer of 2009. His schedule demanded perfection night after night, and the pressure to deliver was unlike anything most people could comprehend. The story of what happened during his final hours is not just a tale of tragedy. It is a story about systemic failure, misplaced trust, and the devastating consequences when those responsible for protection become the agents of harm. When Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009, the world stopped. People gathered in the streets, outside hospitals, and wherever they could find space to mourn. The grief was overwhelming because Jackson was more than an entertainer. He was woven into the fabric of people's lives. Generations had grown up with his voice. Families had danced to his music. His presence in popular culture was so deeply embedded that his sudden absence felt impossible to process. But amid the global mourning, few people understood what had actually happened in the hours leading up to his death. The public narrative was simple. The king of pop had passed away. But the reality was far more disturbing. His final 24 hours exposed a pattern of medical negligence, professional incompetence, and a physician whose priorities were tragically misaligned with his duties. Dr. Conrad Murray, the man entrusted with Jackson's health, failed at nearly every level of his responsibility. And the consequences of that failure would resonate far beyond that rented mansion in Holmby Hills. Let us go back to the beginning of that final day. June 24th, 2009 was supposed to be just another rehearsal. The Staples Center in Los Angeles was buzzing with activity as Jackson prepared for his highly anticipated return to the stage. The This Is It tour was slated to open in London within weeks, and the stakes could not have been higher. 50 shows at the O2 Arena, millions of dollars invested, the weight of an entire legacy resting on this comeback. Jackson had been rehearsing for months, pushing himself harder than anyone realized. On that evening, Jackson appeared to be in full command. He wore his signature black jacket and tied back his hair with the effortless style that had become his trademark. His voice soared through the arena as he performed hits like Billie Jean and Earth Song. His movements were precise and powerful, demonstrating that despite his age and the toll of years in the spotlight, he still possessed the magic that had captivated audiences for decades. Director Kenny Ortega, who had worked with Jackson for years, watched from the control booth with admiration. Everything seemed perfect. Jackson was laughing with his dancers, joking with his musicians, offering encouragement to everyone around him. He was a master at work, fully in control of his craft. The rehearsal reached its emotional peak when Jackson was lifted into the air on a cherry picker. He rose above the arena floor, looking down at his team from a height that seemed to symbolize his career itself. He had always been above everyone else in his field, and this moment captured that feeling perfectly. When the rehearsal ended, Jackson thanked everyone for their dedication and departed in a convoy of SUVs. It was now past midnight, and June 25th had begun. He returned to the mansion at 100 North Carrollwood Drive, where his children were already asleep, and Dr. Murray was waiting upstairs. The property itself was a study in contrasts. It was lavish and well-appointed, rented at enormous expense to provide Jackson with the privacy he needed during this intense period. But inside its walls, a crisis was building. The isolation that was supposed to protect him from the outside world had become a trap. Jackson had stopped eating properly. His appetite had been declining for weeks, and Chef Kai Chase noted that he barely touched the food she prepared. His exhaustion was evident to anyone who looked closely, but the demands of the tour left little room for rest. At the top of the stairs, in Jackson's private quarters, Dr. Conrad Murray was waiting. Murray was a cardiologist who had been hired to provide medical support during the tour preparations, but the role he had taken on was far beyond his expertise. Jackson's most pressing health issue was not his heart, it was his inability to sleep. Insomnia had plagued him for years, worsening as the pressures of the tour intensified. Colleagues who had worked with Jackson in the 1990s recalled him staying awake for days at a time, sometimes experiencing hallucinations from sheer exhaustion. The condition had become a crisis by 2009, and Jackson had found a dangerous solution. He called it his milk. The white milky liquid was propofol, a powerful anesthetic that induces unconsciousness. It is meant to be used only in hospital settings by trained anesthesiologists. It is not a sleep aid. It is a drug that puts patients under for surgical procedures, but Jackson had become dependent on it. He believed it was the only way he could rest. Murray had been procuring propofol in large quantities from a pharmacy in Las Vegas, transporting it to Los Angeles, and administering it to Jackson nightly in the weeks before his death. This arrangement was dangerous on multiple levels. Murray was not trained in anesthesiology. No, he had no experience with sleep disorders. He was providing a drug that could easily be fatal outside a controlled medical environment. The quantities he ordered were staggering. Over 4 gallons of propofol had been purchased in the period leading up to Jackson's death. Some of it was stored at his girlfriend's apartment. There were no patient records, no documentation of dosages, no monitoring equipment. Everything about the arrangement screamed of negligence. On the night of June 24th and into the morning of June 25th, Murray began administering a series of drugs designed to help Jackson sleep. Around 1:30 a.m., he gave Jackson 10 milligrams of Valium. The drug had no effect. At 2 a.m., Murray administered 2 milligrams of lorazepam intravenously. An hour later, he gave another dose. Jackson remained awake. He was agitated, desperate for rest, asking repeatedly for his milk. He knew what would work when nothing else did. Over the next several hours, Murray continued piling on medications. He administered midazolam, another sedative. Jackson's body was resisting, and Murray seemed unable to find the right combination. The situation was becoming desperate. At 10:40 a.m., Murray finally gave in. He injected 25 milligrams of propofol intravenously through a cannula already in place. The white liquid entered Jackson's bloodstream, and within moments, his breathing slowed. His eyes closed. Unconsciousness had finally arrived. It would be the last time Michael Jackson ever opened his eyes. Propofol is a respiratory depressant. It slows breathing and can stop it entirely if not carefully monitored. In a hospital setting, patients receiving propofol are connected to equipment that tracks their oxygen levels and triggers alarms if breathing becomes dangerously shallow. None of that equipment was present in Jackson's bedroom. Murray had no pulse oximeter with an alarm. He had no capnography monitor to measure respiration. He was essentially working blind, with no way to know what was happening to his patient. The minutes that followed were critical. While Jackson lay unconscious, Murray was distracted. Phone records show he made multiple calls during this period. He spoke to his girlfriend, Nicole Alvarez. He contacted a medical clinic in Houston. He engaged in various conversations that lasted minutes at a time. Instead of monitoring Jackson's vital signs, Murray was busy with his phone. It was negligence of the highest order. At some point between 11:00 a.m. and noon, Murray realized something was wrong. His testimony about exactly when this happened is inconsistent and raises serious questions. He claimed that he returned from the bathroom and found Jackson not breathing, but he also claimed that Jackson still had a weak pulse and was warm to the touch. This does not match what others observed. Bodyguard Alberto Alvarez entered the room around noon after hearing Murray's panicked calls. What he found was far worse. Jackson's eyes were open, his mouth was open, his body was already cold. The discrepancy suggests that Murray waited before seeking help, perhaps trying to conceal what had happened. Phone records reveal that Murray made a call at 11:51 a.m. to cocktail waitress Sade Anding. During that conversation, he apparently realized Jackson had stopped breathing. He laid down the phone, but the line remained open, and Anding later reported hearing coughing and mumbling in the background. Murray also made calls to other patients and checked voicemail messages during this period. The minutes were slipping away, and Jackson was lying unconscious, oxygen deprivation causing irreversible damage to his brain. The 911 call finally came at 12:21 p.m., placed by Alvarez. The dispatch operator instructed Alvarez to move Jackson to the floor to perform CPR effectively. But confusion reigned in the background. Murray could be heard asking if anyone knew how to perform CPR correctly. When he attempted resuscitation, he did so on the soft mattress, placing one hand under Jackson's body while pressing with the other. This technique is ineffective and likely contributed to the failure of the resuscitation efforts. The time for a successful intervention had already passed. Paramedics from the Los Angeles Fire Department arrived at 12:26 p.m., just 5 minutes after the emergency call. They found Jackson on the bedroom floor with fixed and dilated pupils. There was no heartbeat. The scene appeared staged, with the room warm to an unusually high temperature. The IV line was still in place. The paramedics applied a defibrillator, but there was no rhythm. They administered epinephrine and atropine. Nothing worked. Despite protocol requiring them to continue efforts, they knew Jackson was already gone. The ambulance journey to UCLA Medical Center was a silent ride, with no lights or sirens because the paramedics understood that the patient was not viable. Murray continued chest compressions during the transport, insisting he could feel a pulse. The paramedics could not. At the hospital, doctors fought for over an hour to revive Jackson. Dr. Michelle Cooper led the emergency team. They performed chest compressions. They administered intravenous fluids. They called in specialists. But Jackson's heart had been stopped too long. There was no response to any treatment. At 2:26 p.m., Dr. Cooper officially pronounced Michael Jackson dead. He was 50 years old. Dr. Conrad Murray stood in the corner of the trauma room crying. He could not bring himself to say the words. The medical staff left the room in exhausted silence, knowing they had witnessed something that should never have happened. Outside the hospital, chaos had erupted. Rumors of Jackson's death were spreading quickly. Security personnel rushed through the hallways. Family members arrived, desperate for news. Among them were Jackson's children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket. The nanny and security staff brought them, unaware of the full extent of the tragedy. 11-year-old Paris burst into tears as soon as she entered the building. She seemed to sense that something terrible had happened. When the family was informed of Jackson's death, Paris screamed, "I want my daddy!" Her cry echoed through the hallway, heard by everyone who was there. 12-year-old Prince tried to maintain composure, but the pain was visible in his eyes. 7-year-old Blanket clung to a caregiver's leg, too young to understand, but old enough to feel the fear. Grandmother Catherine Jackson wept with her hands over her heart. The scene was devastating, a moment that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. This was not a natural death. It was a preventable tragedy caused by medical negligence. The innocence of Jackson's children was shattered in that hospital room, and the pain would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The investigation that followed revealed a pattern of deception. Before paramedics even arrived at the Carrollwood mansion, Murray had instructed Alvarez to hide evidence. Vials of propofol were placed in a bag. IV equipment was removed. When paramedics and later investigators arrived, the scene had already been altered. Murray initially claimed he had only used mild sedatives. It took time for the full picture to emerge, and when it did, the details were damning. The autopsy performed by Los Angeles County Coroner Dr. Christopher Rogers on June 26th provided critical evidence. External examination revealed signs of previous surgeries, vitiligo, and hair loss. Jackson's internal organs, however, appeared healthy for his age. There was no heart disease, no liver damage, no blocked vessels. He had not been terminally ill. He was physically capable of surviving. The toxicology report told a different story. Fatal quantities of propofol were found in Jackson's system, along with lorazepam, midazolam, diazepam, and lidocaine. The combination was lethal. Acute propofol intoxication combined with benzodiazepine poisoning had stopped Jackson's heart. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide. Jackson's healthy organs and the absence of any other fatal condition meant that, without this negligence, he would still be alive. When Murray was interrogated 2 days after Jackson's death, his story shifted. Initially, he did not mention propofol. He claimed to have used only mild sedatives, but pharmacy records contradicted this story. Confronted with the evidence, Murray admitted to using propofol nightly for 6 weeks. He claimed Jackson had requested the drug, begging for it as a way to sleep. But Murray could not explain the inconsistencies in his timeline, the missing vials, or the delayed emergency call. The narrative kept changing, and each change raised more questions. Why did Murray wait so long to call 911? Why did he hide evidence? Why was there no proper monitoring equipment in the room? These questions haunted the investigation. Murray's actions pointed to a man more concerned with covering his tracks than saving his patient. The pressure Jackson faced during this period was immense. The This Is It tour represented a massive financial commitment. AEG Live, the promoter, had invested millions. There were serious consequences if the shows were canceled. Jackson had been working late into the night, perfecting every detail. Director Kenny Ortega had emailed executives just days before, expressing concern about Jackson's health. The signs were there, but no one intervened effectively. Jackson's dependence on propofol had been building over time. He viewed it as his only escape, the only way he could rest. Murray provided that escape, despite knowing the risks. The combination of propofol with benzodiazepines created a deadly synergy. Both drugs depressed the respiratory system. Together, they stopped Jackson's breathing. Without proper monitoring, Murray had no way to know what was happening until it was too late. The scene inside the Carrollwood mansion on the morning of June 25th was chaotic. Chef Kai Chase arrived around 8 a.m. unaware of the tragedy unfolding upstairs. She prepared breakfast for the children, who were still asleep. It seemed like a normal morning. But around noon, the peaceful atmosphere shattered. Murray rushed down the stairs, frantic, ordering Chase to call security and find Prince. Paramedics arrived soon after. The kitchen became a scene of crisis. Police later searched the mansion thoroughly. In a closet, they found Murray's medical bag containing 11 bottles of propofol. 3 of them were already empty. There was also lorazepam, midazolam, and other medications. An oxygen tank with a regulator stood nearby. An empty saline bottle hung on an IV stand. The equipment suggested attempts to administer medication and, later, to remove evidence. Receipts from the pharmacy told the full story. Murray had been purchasing propofol in bulk for weeks. Some of it had been delivered to his girlfriend's apartment. There was no patient documentation, no records of administration, no explanation for why such enormous quantities were needed. This was not a medical practice. This was a makeshift anesthesia operation in a rented mansion, completely unregulated and unsafe. By 3 p.m., the Carrollwood mansion was sealed. Jackson's children were escorted away, never to return. The staff was dismissed. The property became a crime scene. Outside, news helicopters circled overhead. Broadcast vans lined the streets. Inside, silence replaced the music that had once filled the hallways. Half-eaten meals sat on counters. Personal belongings remained where they were left. The golden throne in the corridor stood as a silent reminder of what had happened. When the sun set that evening, the news was official. Michael Jackson was dead. The world reeled at the announcement. But the full story of what happened behind those closed doors would take months to emerge. The trial of Dr. Conrad Murray would eventually reveal the full extent of the negligence involved. Murray's trial became a media sensation. The prosecution argued that Murray had acted with gross negligence, administering dangerous drugs without proper monitoring and delaying emergency care. The defense argued that Jackson had essentially caused his own death by demanding propofol. But the jury found Murray guilty of involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, serving a portion of that time before being released. The death of Michael Jackson exposed the dark side of celebrity medicine, the pressures of fame, the demands of a high-stakes tour, and the availability of a doctor willing to cross ethical lines combined in a lethal mixture. Jackson's own struggles with insomnia and his reliance on dangerous solutions played a role, but ultimate responsibility lay with the physician who should have protected him. There are deeper questions that remain unanswered. Why did no one intervene earlier? Why was Jackson so isolated? Why did the system designed to support him fail so completely? The answers are complex, involving both personal choices and systemic failures. Jackson was surrounded by people who were either too afraid to challenge him or too focused on their own interests to truly protect him. Murray's actions on June 25, 2009, set in motion a chain of events that could not be stopped. The lack of proper monitoring, the delayed emergency call, the ineffective CPR attempts, the concealment of evidence, each step made the outcome more certain. By the time help arrived, it was already too late. Jackson's legacy is vast. His music, his dancing, his cultural influence continues to resonate, but his final years reveal the dangers of unchecked dependence and insufficient oversight. The entertainment industry has since examined its practices regarding artist welfare, but questions remain about how much has truly changed. When we reflect on the story, we must remember the human cost. A beloved father died too young. Children were left without their parent. Fans across the world mourned the loss of an artist who had given them so much joy. And the tragedy was entirely preventable if proper monitoring had been in place, if emergency procedures had been followed, if one phone call had been made just minutes earlier. Small changes could have produced a completely different outcome. The story of Michael Jackson's final hours is a cautionary tale about the consequences of negligence, the failures of the healthcare system when it prioritizes profit over care, and the unique vulnerabilities of those who live in the spotlight. It reminds us that even the most brilliant performers are human, capable of making dangerous choices when they are desperate and exhausted. And for those who love Jackson, for those who grew up with his music, the sadness endures. The legacy of his art remains undiminished, but the circumstances of his death continue to provoke anger and grief. The weight of what happened on June 25, 2009 will never fully disappear. It lives on in the memories of those who were there, in the testimony of witnesses, and in the hearts of millions who still mourn. Michael Jackson was a genius, a performer who defined an era, but he was also a man struggling with challenges that ultimately overwhelmed him. His story reminds us of the importance of compassion, of the need to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and of the devastating consequences when those we trust fail us. The investigation into Jackson's death concluded with Murray's conviction, but the questions it raised about celebrity culture, medical ethics, and personal responsibility continue to resonate. As we look back at this moment, we must ask ourselves how we can do better, how we can ensure that no one else suffers the same fate, and how we can honor Jackson's legacy by learning from what went wrong. Jackson's family was left to pick up the pieces. Katherine Jackson, who had already lost a son to the pressures of fame, now faced the task of raising 3 grandchildren. The children themselves were thrown into a world of chaos and grief. Paris eventually spoke about her struggles in interviews, revealing the depth of her pain. Prince carried forward his father's legacy through charitable work and public appearances. Blanket, now known as Biggie, chose a more private life, seeking to escape the constant scrutiny that had defined his father's existence. Each of them dealt with the tragedy in their own way, but none of them were ever the same. The media frenzy that followed Jackson's death was relentless. Every detail of his final hours was dissected and analyzed. Conspiracy theories flourished. Blame was assigned and reassigned. But amid the noise, the fundamental truth remained clear. A man died because those who were supposed to protect him failed. The system that enabled this failure was complex, involving doctors, managers, promoters, and family members. But at the center of it all was Dr. Conrad Murray, a man who took on responsibilities he was not qualified to handle and made choices that cost a life. The legal proceedings against Murray dragged on for years. His trial was a spectacle, drawing media attention from around the world. The prosecution painted him as a reckless physician who prioritized his own interests over his patient's safety. The defense argued that Jackson was a manipulative addict who had effectively forced Murray to comply with his demands. The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution, finding Murray guilty of involuntary manslaughter. But the verdict did little to bring closure. Jackson was still gone, the children were still fatherless, and the world was still processing the loss of an icon. In the years since Jackson's death, there has been some reflection on how the music industry handles artist welfare. Touring schedules have been scrutinized. Medical oversight has been strengthened in some cases. But the fundamental pressures that drive performers to push themselves beyond their limits remain. The demand for constant productivity, the financial incentives, the fear of disappointing fans, all of these factors continue to create conditions where tragedy can occur. Jackson's death was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern of artists being pushed to exhaustion, and it is not the only example of what can go wrong when the industry prioritizes profit over people. Murray's trial revealed uncomfortable truths about the entertainment industry, the lack of accountability, the willingness to overlook red flags, the belief that talent somehow makes a person invulnerable. These attitudes have persisted despite the lessons of Jackson's death, and they continue to put artists at risk. For fans, the loss of Michael Jackson was deeply personal. His music had been a constant presence in their lives. His dances had inspired them. His voice had comforted them in times of sadness. To lose him was to lose a piece of their own history. The grief was compounded by the knowledge that his death could have been prevented. That sense of injustice has never fully dissipated, and it colors the way Jackson's legacy is remembered. The medical community also faced scrutiny in the aftermath of Jackson's death. How could a physician like Dr. Murray have been allowed to practice? How could he have obtained such massive quantities of a dangerous drug without proper oversight? The answers were uncomfortable. The regulatory system had failed. Murray had been able to operate with impunity because no one was watching closely enough. The case exposed gaps in the system that had to be addressed. But the fixes have been slow in coming, and similar cases have occurred in the years since. Jackson's own role in his death cannot be ignored. He was a grown man who made choices about his own health. He sought out propofol. He pressured Murray to provide it. He was aware of the risks, at least to some extent. But his desperation for sleep clouded his judgment. He was not thinking clearly. The demands of his schedule and the pressure to perform had overwhelmed his ability to make sound decisions. He needed someone to step in and protect him from himself. Murray did not do that. He enabled the behavior that ultimately killed Jackson. The tragedy of Jackson's death is that it was so avoidable. Proper monitoring equipment would have alerted Murray to Jackson's declining oxygen levels. Timely intervention would have prevented the brain damage that occurred. A simple call to emergency services earlier would have given paramedics a chance to save him. Each of these failures was the result of negligence, and each one could have been fixed with minimal effort. In the end, Jackson's death remains a cautionary tale for the music industry, for the medical profession, and for anyone who has ever trusted someone with their safety. It is a reminder that we cannot assume those around us have our best interests at heart. It is a reminder that the systems we rely on can fail, and it is a reminder that even the most talented among us are vulnerable to the pressures that can drive them to desperate measures. Michael Jackson's music continues to be heard around the world. His influence can be seen in countless artists who followed him. His contributions to entertainment are immeasurable, but his death is a stain on his legacy, a tragedy that overshadows even his greatest achievements. It is a story that will be told for generations, not just as a warning, but as a testament to the fragility of life and the consequences of neglecting those we love. The final hours of Michael Jackson's life were a tragedy of errors, a doctor who should have known better, a patient who was desperate for rest, a system that failed to intervene, and a world that was left to mourn a loss that never should have happened. When we look back at that night, we see the failure of individuals and institutions. We see the consequences of ignoring warning signs, and we see the devastating impact of one preventable mistake. Jackson's children, now grown, have carried his legacy forward in their own ways. They have spoken about his love for them. They have shared memories of the father they knew, not just the icon the world saw. And they have worked to preserve his legacy for future generations. But the pain of losing him will always be with them. They were robbed of a father by negligence, and no amount of success or fame can ever compensate for that loss. The story of Michael Jackson's final hours is a sobering reminder of the importance of vigilance and accountability. It shows us what can happen when we let our guard down. It shows us what can happen when we trust the wrong people. And it shows us that even the brightest stars can be extinguished by the darkness of negligence and deceit. As we reflect on this tragedy, we must ask ourselves what we can learn from it. We must demand better from those we trust with our health. We must hold people accountable for their actions. And we must never forget the human cost of failure. Michael Jackson was more than an entertainer. He was a father, a brother, a son, and a friend. His life mattered. His death mattered. And the lessons of his final hours must not be lost on us. The world continues to mourn Michael Jackson. His music lives on. His influence endures. But the circumstances of his death remain a source of pain and anger for his family, his fans, and anyone who believes in justice. The trial of Dr. Conrad Murray provided some answers, but it did not bring closure. The questions that linger are not just about what happened, but about how we can prevent it from happening again. Michael Jackson was one of the greatest entertainers of all time. He gave the world music that will be remembered forever, but his final hours were marked by neglect and misconduct. The legacy he left behind is complex, filled with triumphs and tragedies. And as we remember him, we must also remember the lessons his death teaches us. We must be vigilant. We must hold people accountable. And we must never forget the human cost of failure.